really excited to do this. Just to introduce everybody again, Hans Schaefer, Senior Vice President of Global Touring at Live Nation, John Lieberberg of Baron Management, where he manages Uchis. So we're really excited to talk about this. We were talking a little bit before the session and just really kind of connecting about just how much activity and excitement there's been over global touring in general. Both, we've seen Latin artists as a great example of how there's such a demand for these artists all over the world. There's also, a huge appetite for Anglo artists as well in Latin America. I wonder if we can start a little bit by talking about how you guys kind of see this growth in global touring and kind of where you think it sort of started. And Hans, maybe we can start with you.
Obviously the sort of, the social media platforms have allowed access to music, right? We've become a much more integrated, I think, community over globally where you have access to all this music. That's been the big driver for the content to kind of reach new barriers and hit new places. And then what we've seen is I think one part of it is language. Another part is we're moving around. We're emigrating to different countries, and that landscape is evolving and changing. We're seeing, Karol G going out and touring in Europe, and it's a Latin fan base in Zurich, in Switzerland, in Belgium, and in a lot of places. So, part of it, yes, there's a driver of the fan is crossing over, which is something I talk about a lot. It's not the music, the artists aren't crossing over, fans are crossing over. They're listening to music in Spanish, right? That happens to be Latin. But that I think is one of the main drivers for the international and globalization of international touring. You can give us some.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on most of the good points here, but I think social media in general is obviously like a huge driver, and I mean, through TikTok, I feel like people are we're more in this interconnected global space where, hey, I'm gonna check out, here is Burna Boy from Nigeria, and I'm like, this is great, and you see the success of that. And then vice versa in the Latin space, with, people like Bad Bunny having these, insane years back to back. And you just see that there's more of an appetite maybe on a socio-cultural level for, things from music from different places, and I think it's also, you touched on the language barrier, that you make a connection with music regardless if you understand the lyrics or not, and that's also ever expanding, and I think the discovery on social media has definitely been like a main driver for that too.
Yeah. There was a point, I think, during the pandemic where there was a lot of sort of doom and gloom about when live music was going to get back. It seemed at one point, we're imagining sort of the movement that we're having right now in global touring seemed almost difficult. But then that hasn't been the case at all. We've seen a tremendous amount of activity and a tremendous amount of excitement. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the impact of the last few years and how sort of fans have opened up again and kind of demanded to see these artists that maybe they were listening to and wanting to bring to their cities.
Yeah, I think we're, in general, we're social creatures, and content definitely is king, but the only thing to surpass that is experiencing it live. And I think there's always going to be that need. There's always going to be that time for people to kind of come together and live those moments. Certainly, I think it was a matter of when, not if. And we were all very clear on the path that sort of needed to happen to safely sort of bring that back.
Yeah. To add to that, I think also during the pandemic, and we all remember it, it was crazy days. Now looking back at it, it's almost surreal. But I think it's like the people were starved for human interaction and also for like experiences. And we touched on it a little bit before the panel, that there's obviously this, especially in 23, 24, coming out of the pandemic, we saw this, we had back-to-back the two craziest touring years we've ever done, right? Like more stadium shows than ever before, right? More, fans just going out there, spending money and wanting to be at these shows, and which kind of shows us too, there's more of an experience culture now where, people are like, hey, I need to be there, I need to experience this, and I think that's sort of been coming out of the pandemic, has been like sort of maybe like a psychological effect of why people are so hungry for more content and more life experiences, you know. Yeah.
One thing that we were talking about too was sort of this need to be there, you know, even if, you know, you can just say that you
if it's not on your timeline, you know, like it didn't exist, you know. So yeah, people are definitely, you have to be there. Yeah.
Getting back to sort of the artists themselves, we've seen so many global careers, and especially with Latin artists and artists who have transcended borders. We've mentioned Bad Bunny, we've mentioned Karol G, we've mentioned Uchis. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how these artists have created these international fan bases and what the demand for them looks like all over the world, really.
I mean, maybe I start with Kelly, and then you can talk a little bit more about Bad Bunny. And I mean, with Kelly, it's an interesting, case because Kelly is, sort of like the best of both worlds. You know, where she, was born and raised between Colombia and the United States, and I think there's an ever increasing, world, especially in North America, where hey, here's second, third generation kids, they came from, Mexico or other Latin places, and they are now living in the United States, and this whole idea of hey, this is Spanglish, right? Like Kelly's music is, it's indie, it's English, but it's also like very heavy Latin. And I think that has been interesting for us. We see the growth in that kind of world and the demand. When we go to our shows, we see how kids are, older fans are just singing along to every song, and we see like that's sort of the trick that does it for us at the minute. Is really like that's hey, this is like a hybrid of the best of Latin, the best of what the U.S. has to offer. And it's just like this amalgamation of cultures that come into play.
And like the authenticity, right, of those artists, especially when we talk about the like Latin music in the U.S. Authenticity, I think, is key to connecting, right? And Cali is a great example. Becky G has a great video on how her album talks about this idea of 200%, which is something that I relate to, right? Born in Miami, Venezuelan, Spanish, German kind of mix. You go to Spain, you're not Spanish enough. You go to Venezuela, you're not Venezuelan enough. Out here, you're not American enough, right? But I sort of identify with all three, and that's the concept that Becky talks about is the 200%. I'm 100% this, 100% that. In her case, Mexican American. And I think those things, right, especially an artist like Callie, an artist like Becky, where they come from these different worlds in the U.S., is having a tremendous impact because we see ourselves in them, right? We see ourselves in them not just as an artist, but we see themselves as who we are and in the identity of our culture, our roots, our shared sort of social values.
I want to talk about one particular moment that we were talking about before, but a big sort of watershed moment, I think, in what's happening today really felt like it was when Los Bukis went on tour in 2021 and did stadium tours. Hans, I know that you were really pivotal to making that happen and to champion that and to really kind of prove that Latin artists were incredibly global, could sell out stadiums. And since that happened, I mean, we've seen Karol G sell out 50,000 person shows 2 nights in a row. We've seen Bad Bunny sell out, Yankee Stadium two times in a row. Talk about that initial moment of kind of championing that and seeing the vision there.
I mean, with Bukis, it was such a special moment because it was a cultural importance that either you knew it was there, right? There was nothing in socials. There wasn't these big, social media numbers or streaming numbers that was going to tell you this like obvious story that unfolded. It was really about going back again, like, right, you are what you live and the people that you share it with, and understanding who Los Bukis were to my friends, to a generation who never got to see them live because they grew up listening to them because their parents listened to them in the house, but they never had the opportunity. It was a band that was gone for 25, 30 years. And the conversation was always they're never getting back together. So these things I knew were gonna have a huge impact, not on the people who lived it, but the generation afterwards as well. I mean, one of the biggest examples we had is the Los Bukis on sale was trending on TikTok because people were actively going and buying tickets and, hey dad, it's Happy Father's Day. And capturing that moment of tears, laughter, like joy. Our employees, my colleagues, all lived it. Like we understood what was going on, and so we took a bet and we took a swing. I believed it was possible, and it seemed very realistic. There's a great story about the 4-minute mile. Roger Bannister, British marathon runner, right? 1956. Nobody thought it was possible to run under 4 minutes. 1956, this guy does it right, just shy, like 3:57, 3:59, something right below it. After that, the years follow. It sort of opened up the floodgates, right? It became this sort of because I go back to these are like self-limiting beliefs. And once we're able to break that barrier down, then you sort of see that like others can follow and others can do. And I think we've seen that, right? That was I think the moment of Bukis was breaking the 4-minute mile in the U.S. Because then Karol came, Grupo Firme came, Aventura came, Bunny came, and there's going to be more. There's definitely going to be more. Now I believe it's just opened the gates.
What's it been like seeing that gate open for you with your artists? I mean, we've also seen Gali do some incredible things and playing Latin American giant festivals and reaching audiences everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we again, this I hate the term, but like the Spanglish, thing has really opened up, and as you see it growing and growing, like it just. As the Latin space is ever evolving, from these traditional bands that we just talked about, Kelly is sort of maybe like a next generation artist, that also in a weird way embodies this kind of American journey, right? Like with, immigrant parents and then kind of being raised in between, two very different countries and bringing that kind of, okay, hey, here's the Spanish side, the Spanish speaking, here's the English speaking, and the two different cultures that are meshing more and more. We just saw it, again, going back to the pandemic, and the pandemic was really like a pivotal moment because while everything was shutting down and many people had it was really hard for promoters, for artists to kind of, hey, what are we doing right now? We're losing all these revenue streams and, nothing seems to be connecting. But at the same time, like Kelly had, with Telepatia, which is the epitome of that kind of Spanglish song, we had completely in an organic way, we had this huge moment that just kept growing and growing. I remember seeing it like, oh, here's 100,000 kids that kind of put videos together to that song. And then eventually it became 1 million. And, at one point you see, middle-aged soccer mommies, like kind of doing cooking videos to it, or just the most absurd stuff, but people are using that sound, and eventually becomes like sort of this game-changing experience. So for us, kind of then coming out of the pandemic, the demand for touring was so, huge that, we literally, I think in the shortest amount of time, and also Hans and I have worked on this closely together, quickly moved it from, bigger slots at festivals, where we saw her commanding huge crowds, and then into, and also always tapping into both kind of crowds, right? So Kelly functions at a, as well as at a Coachella and Lolla, as well as she does at, yeah, correct. Any kind of Latin-specific festivals, So the, that is definitely one of the trends that we've seen, and the, at this point, we then took it from literally big theaters where we knew we're going to do an underplay, right, into the arenas where we kind of got to a place where we put the Hollywood Bowl on sale and sold it out, I guess, in 10 minutes or something, which is 17,000 tickets. And you see it especially in these strong holds of, and where you have strong Latin communities in the United States, anywhere from Texas to California, but also Chicago and, business is just exploding, and I think you feel that too on other artists.
Yeah, and the markets are expanding, right? I mean, it would be very common to be, a 15, 20 city tour in the U.S. for a Latin tour, right? I mean, we're now hitting somewhere in the 40s, 40 to 60 dates, right? Over different legs, smaller markets, but emerging markets that are definitely important, significant, and you're seeing big growth, right? Places, Greensboro, North Carolina, there used to be no Latin shows, right? We went to Rogers, Arkansas, and it was the biggest show that Rogers, Arkansas had ever seen with Peso Pluma. It was bigger than Foo Fighters. It was bigger than any general market show that they had in the past. And part of it is, right, is serving underserved markets, right? Like nobody would go to Rogers, and then all of a sudden it was the biggest thing. It was like, oh, this is great. It's a great market, right? So I think that's also allowing for artists to go a little bit deeper, not have to necessarily repeat the same markets over and over, year and year again. Which some artists do fall into that. So this allows you to sort of strategically build your touring career over the course of multiple years and not burn out your markets.
What do you attribute those emerging markets to? Do you think that's demographic changes? Is it just the power of these bicultural artists who've been able to connect? Is it just the fact that these communities haven't been served before? Is it a mix of all three?
I think mostly a lot of it is people moving around, right? I mean, you got to look at this over the course of like 25 years so you see sort of the impact and where things have been moving, right? A lot of the Mexican American community has been pushing further east, further north, right, as opportunities open up, and like different communities are looking for population in general, like come into their cities and their growth, and we're a huge growth of the economy. And so I do think that has reshaped what the U.S. has looked like, specifically the U.S. has looked like over the years. But we spoke about it as well, even for like Europe, for Spain, right? There was a huge influx of, for example, Ecuadorians back in '99 that sort of started to reshape what Spain looks like and the idea of what Spain looks like. Obviously Venezuelans, there's been a huge spike of Venezuelans that now live overseas. That's allowed now other artists to go out and tour, right? We take Marco Antonio Solis, doesn't have to be Bad Bunny, doesn't have to be Karol G. Marco Antonio Solis going to Milan, going to Zurich, going to Spain, right? When traditionally it was not really there. So I think it's a combination, depending on the artist. Some of it is crossing over, and some of it is people moving around.
Also, like, you see it on festivals, right? Like, I mean, this year Coachella, with Peso headlining, and I mean, there's just such a, I think, like, yeah, promoters, everybody's kind of, things are crossing over and people are more open to it. And I think why you and I are not both crazy on data, data is a big part of it, right? We have to look at things, and then you see the shift that you described, but like also like, if we take the simplest form of data that we have to sometimes use, is like, hey, what are the strongest markets, the biggest streaming markets on Spotify? Right, and you'll always discover, like on the last Cali run, the data kept pointing to Sacramento, right? And Sacramento is by no means like a massive, like, it's not your favorite touring market, right? No disrespect to Sacramento, but it's like, it's not LA, it's not San Francisco, like it's not Oakland, but there's an arena, and there's a good arena, right? Like, and we kept kind of thinking, like, again, we've never played in Sacramento before, and we all kind of said, like, okay, let's try it out, because clearly the biggest streaming market seems to be Sacramento, like these last couple of years, and we go to Sacramento, of course, and we crush, so yeah, that helps too.
I love Cali is such a great example of like what's happening in the U.S. and I think the future of Latin music in the U.S. because we refer to Latin music as if like if it was a genre, and it's not. It's really happens to be Latin music is it's a language. It's in Spanish. It's music that's in Spanish is really sort of the more clearly defined definition of what Latin music is. But that also feels like it's changing, right? And Cali is really at the forefront of what is Latin music now, right? Because she's a Latin artist, she's also an American artist. She sings in English, she sings in Spanish. So where do you sort of draw the line, and where does that line become, it feels like that line is becoming more blurred and sort of redefining in the next 10, 15 years, the next Kali Uchis, the next Becky G's, the next artists that are born here and really do live in both worlds and embrace that, right? Because we've seen in the past, without, on specifics, but there are artists that have just said, no, I'm going to go the traditional general market in English route, because that was their dream, and that's fine, right? And there was also a time period, which I think is important, where Latin wasn't cool. Like, no, we're gonna go do it this way. And then there was a change. There was a change in a year. I mean, around 17, I feel like is when it really the conversation started to shift. And then people were all of a sudden like claiming my grandmother's Latin, right? And and more hands were raised as to where your roots and where your identity all of a sudden was important into that background. That is, I think, going to be the interesting shift over the next 15 years of what does it sound like.
Yeah, you're speaking my language, because this idea of Latin music is such a conflicted term, because we're really talking about dozens of genres from dozens of countries, and now we have this intergenerational element to it too, where it's not just Latin artists specifically, it's Latin American artists, Latin dash American.
My name is Hans Schaefer, so that's already John Lieberberg here. So
I think a lot of what we're talking about is really powerful in terms of the power of these Latin artists that we've seen, the power of a bicultural consumer. I do also want to talk about some of the challenges involved here, because a more global, touring economy also has some pretty big logistical steps, and there's a lot of things that it takes to really get these things to happen. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that, kind of what the challenges are of the moment that we're in right now and how we keep scaling this.
I mean, volume, right? I mean, the obvious one is volume, manpower, lights available, equipment, trucks, buses, logistics is definitely, I think, probably the number one challenge, right? Which is forcing, I think, the conversation where you need to plan better, right? You need to plan a little bit more further in advance if you want things to, run a certain way, or have the best available dates, or have better budgets, right? Everything becomes a driver for planning. I think that's the biggest thing. So, for me, having a global partner, obviously on what we do, having boots on the ground, having access to production companies globally, or contacts with those, that allows us to be a little bit more nimble and react to those challenges. I think that's probably the number one challenge in terms of going out and touring. There's only a certain amount of dates that you find in the arenas and the venues that you go to, and there's only a certain amount of equipment and people who are who have the background and the expertise in those areas. I don't know if you see any other challenges from.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so many Hanses, who can actually do the job good, well, and I mean, that's why it's great to work, and maybe I'm biased because I'm an ex-Live Nation guy, so I was also focusing on international touring for a long time. The Live Nation, as much of a behemoth and huge company as it is, it obviously brings huge benefits to it, because, as Hans said, it truly operates on a global level. And you have, there's promoters and staff in every single territory, and very seasoned staff, because Live Nation has literally aligned themselves years ago by identifying the best independent promoters in every market, right? And so through this vertically integrated system, of hey, we have the promoters, we have the production crew, we have the ticketing, we got the venues, we got the festivals, like you do as an artist. And as an artist manager, there's huge benefits that come with that full service. And huge challenges, obviously, is, again, ever since the pandemic, seems to be my favorite reference today, the pandemic, it's but you know what I mean, right? Like, the pandemic we're still suffering from stuff like, shortages on, it's also the staff, touring has always been a lot of freelancers, and you had these iconic, I would call them road warriors, guys who have been touring for 20, 30 years, straight, and have jumped on tour and tour and tour, and it's a profession, it's almost like a cultural thing, right? Like, I'm on tour, and these guys have been out of a job for a really long time, so now there's I think there's shortages in the service industry. We all feel it, right? In restaurants and here and there, and, just like seasoned expertise kind of staff. And we have that in touring now too. So, as an artist based in Latin America or in North America, trying to kind of successfully tour in Europe, you either need to have a really solid foundation, fan base, business that can kind of sustain it. Obviously, you're not feeling the pains if you're playing arenas in Europe or in South America, it's fine. But, if you're at the cusp of anywhere theater 1,500 cap to 5,000 cap, I think it's really hard, and that's where the touring experts need to come in, where you need to have, hey, there's more, I mean, myself as a manager with my touring background, comes easier to me, but, like again, budgets, the having the right staff, like a production manager, a tour manager, these guys that can kind of save you costs, make smart decisions, the also reining in the artist shows, right? Because, like you look at a lot of these shows and everybody, you go to a concert and you're expecting an LED screen and you're expecting pyro and you're expecting all these things, but yeah, good luck taking that to Europe for like 5 shows, like you're gonna struggle, financially. And that's where you see more and more, you see these articles of like artists having to cancel the European dates, having to cancel Latin shows. Like, that's where, like, I think, the one of the biggest, entry into Latin America is, I think we would agree, is the Lolas, right? So Lollapalooza, where you do have the expertise of a company like C3, Austin-based, right? And these guys have it dialed in, and they provide a safe framework for a lot of smaller bands to successfully tour out there, So I think, yeah, those are the hurdles, the cost, supply chain issues, like freight, shipping stuff, all the boring stuff that nobody wants to deal with, execution, admin stuff, becomes crazily expensive if you don't plan it accordingly.
And just to add, I mean, you touched on it, but I kind of want to like emphasize it where, like, yes, and it's great because John, talks about Live Nation and how wonderful, like, having that global infrastructure and local resources and boots on the ground. And yes, 100%, but that also works better when you have a great management team. Yeah. When you have their team is also like locked in, dialed, they have experienced people, they know what they're doing. Like, they're running a whole separate line of other budgets to make sure that they're profitable, right? Because you can sell all the tickets, but if you spend all of it, then you got at some point you got to tell the artist, is this a marketing tour? You're going to make zero money. Do you want to do that, or do you want to make some money? Then okay, if we want to make some money, then you got to have people that understand how to reduce that budget. What can you cut? What can you sacrifice? What can you make it a little bit more lean? Or we're saying, no, it's fine. We're going to go out and we're going to spend all this money because I want to invest my career for the next 3 years, and I want to make it into stadiums. I want to give the best show possible that leaves people, it's something that should be in a stadium, and you're throwing it into an arena.
Right? Or into a theater.
Or into a theater. Happens too. But I think it's important to emphasize that as well.
Maybe like one example that everybody knows about, right? We all look at Las Vegas and the Sphere, right? Like U2, and we've all seen the clips on social media, and it blows your mind, But like how many artists can actually afford to do that, and again, not that I have confirmed costs, but like the numbers that are swirling around are, insanely high. And, there's only maybe, like, if you think about, like, what are these A-list bands that can actually play there? So the content creation alone to kind of for these big screens is so expensive. It looks like, oh yeah, there's some visuals on stage, like we have beautiful visuals here, but like, to kind of once you get into 3D visuals or like, moving, like it becomes, I mean, again, there's a lot of manpower behind it, creative directors, LDs, months and months of planning and rehearsal. So by the time, I mean, you see like somebody like Drake goes out on tour, and I think he spends so much money that he needs to, like play the first 10, 15 shows, he probably has to recoup what he's spent on the tour, right? Before he's in profit, right? And that is a lot. That's the new norm that we have, where it's kind of like, okay, you got to spend all this money, and then you got to play at least X amount of shows to kind of break even before you're in profit, So,
So a lot of challenges.
It's a lot of fun, a lot of challenges. Yeah.
I do want to talk about sort of on what this means for the artists themselves. If you are seeing sort of more global careers, artists like Karol, who all of a sudden can play anywhere. What does that mean for the artists themselves? How have you seen that feeding an artist like Karol, who throughout her career, I think we've seen an evolution of, connecting more with her Colombian roots. Her last album, Orquídeas, I think was a really big example of that.
Yeah.
How has it sort of changed in terms of the evolution for the artists themselves?
I mean, Kelly always had that kind of, she's obviously very proud of her Latin heritage, and she always played on it. But like, I think initially Kelly started out as a, I was like, hope she's not gonna be upset with me when I word it like that. But like, an indie R&B type of, indie, like artist, and that then kind of quickly evolved into, if you look at our like the last 4 records that we put out, we put out Isolation, which is predominantly like English speaking. Then the next record that we put out is like heavily, that's where we kind of make the transition into more of a Spanglish, but also like heavily more Latin driven record. And we saw that this is actually like there's a demand for her Latin audience to listen to songs that are more reggaeton or bachata or or even just beautiful 70s inspired Latin crooning, there's all these different genres that Kelly's blending, and it's kind of like also speaks for this, like new how the Latin space is ever evolving. The music that Kelly is making is very different from the music that Bad Bunny is making, but like you see a lot of crossover, you see like the people like Karol G, Kelly and Karol, collaborating, Raul Alejandro and Kelly, so there is this kind of world that is, while it's expanding, like there's a lot of a lot of common ground, and I think that works, so for us it works really well. Like last year we put out 2 records. We had Red Moon and Venus that crushed, and then was more of a English speaking record, and then we just put out the Orquídeas, which is very much, we have Raul Alejandro and we have El Alfa, but we also have JT from the City Girls, so it's we see it expanding and we see it's working, that's really what it is.
Hans, I wonder if you can talk about, I mean, we've seen these incredible stadium tours with artists like Los Bukis, who are, Mexican music. We've seen reggaeton with Bad Bunny. Are there certain genres or sounds or types of artists that you see as kind of the next frontier?
I think we're seeing it now, right? This regional Mexican. This is another one that's also difficult to define, and I think it's always best that the artists define it themselves. But this urban regional music, that's kind of right. The Peso Plumas, Fuerza Regidas, Juniors, Natas, that is been a huge shift in sound and what they talked about, but you clearly know where that's coming from, right? Where those roots are coming from. The elements are there from the heritage. The way it sounds, the way it's shaped, the way it's formed is their own. And I think now the interesting thing to see is how that music is crossing over into the non-Mexican communities, right? So how you're seeing that music penetrate into Spain, how you're seeing that go into Argentina, that wave is a clear trend that I'm seeing, that we're living now. The collaboration between those artists and traditional urban reggaeton artists, right, is not something that you saw until Bunny and Nata, right? Exactly. That opened and changed the conversation, right? Somebody said, "This is cool. Like, I identify this and respect you as an artist and your sound and what you're doing." And now that's just continued to grow, right? And then Bunny did it again with Grupo Frontera. Different sound, not that, but
Cumbia, yeah.
Yeah, cumbia. But it's definitely getting bigger. And you had seen moments of artists doing this, but never with an impact that's created sort of like a trend, right? I think that was the first moment where you're saying. I think that's the interesting thing to kind of keep an eye on, is where that music is going to hit globally.
We touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but there is this amazing cross-pollination also between the Anglo artists who are going to Latin America. And John, you were talking a little bit about having seen this in your experience. And it has so much to do with the globalization of music and the changes and sort of these linguistic barriers that we've thought were there. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and what the demand has looked like in Latin America for Anglo artists.
I mean, there's always, I've been to Argentina maybe, I don't know, 6-7 times, also even remember going to Argentina 15 years ago, and there's always been this huge appetite for, like, randomly in Argentina, like, for rock music, right? Have you seen that? I mean, it's like, they're like, every time I would go there, and they would ask me, like, Yeah, Mexico too. You know, the like, where you from? And I was like, oh, Germany. He was like, oh, and they would name these obscure German rock bands, and I was like, okay, wow. It's like all the way to Buenos Aires and beyond. You know, like so there's always been, or like last time I was there, you know, like last year, you know, like I saw that Kiss was on their global tour, and it was like, you know, playing like some massive stadium. You know, so there's always been that kind of, you know, I guess you know, like this global kind of, you know, exchange, but. Yeah, going back to the festival circuit, you know, like, and it's also like, you know, in some ways, you know, like not crazy, but like it's interesting that these companies, like, you know, like American-based companies, team up with local promoters in South America to set up these huge festivals, right? Like it's, I think one is Lolla, and then the other one, what's the other one that launched last year is.
Rock in Rio in Brazil.
No, Rock in Rio in Brazil, but the last year there was, I guess, was it Primavera in South America? Yeah, exactly, yeah. So, you know, like, and that is mostly designed for, and I feel like, again, Stereo Picnic, yeah, like, which is like a Coachella of Colombia. But you see, like, that the lineup there is very much, you know, like English-speaking artists, you know, and I think because, again, you know, like you tap into, like in any other country, you would tap into two different things, right? You want to see, when we did it last year, was Billie Eilish, it was Cali, you know, it was Drake, you know, and Lil Nas X, you know, like, and plenty of more, but like the majority of them were, you know, like sort of English-speaking American artists, you know. And or I remember when I saw, like, when I went to a Stereo Picnic a couple of years ago, one of the big headliners was Florence and the Machine, and I think Liam or Noel Gallagher, one or the other, and it was huge, you know. I was like, I've not seen a big crowd for Liam Gallagher like that in a long time, you know, like in Bogota, you know. And so yeah, you have, these festivals are designed, I guess, you know, like to kind of cater to that audience. But even there, you know, like it's transitioning more into, we saw like, you know, like the more Latin our set was, right, you know, in Spanish, we also saw like a huge appreciation for that, and fans singing along and really like getting into it. But then again, you see Billy coming in, and kids are, I mean, Billy was huge, you know. It's like, I mean, you couldn't have, you know, I mean, couldn't have been any bigger, yeah.
Hans, so we talked a lot about Latin America, obviously. I wonder if there's other regions or other parts of the world where you see a particularly big demand for these global superstars that are now kind of in the cultural lexicon.
Yeah, Europe obviously is the obvious, but still has work, right? That it hasn't. It's sort of survived, I guess. Really, with using Spain as an anchor, especially with urban reggaeton. There was an explosion in Spain where it wasn't really working, I guess, if you'd say, from like a radio perspective, or at least the feedback that you would get is like, no, that doesn't really work here. And all of a sudden there was this moment in time where it started to explode. You started seeing these reggaeton festivals start popping up all over Spain. Same brand, and they had 10 festivals, and the country's smaller than the size of Texas. So to give you some perspective of how big that became, that has become obviously a very important anchor, as well as a lot of these sort of more general market or multi-genre festivals across Europe wanting to get into Latin. You're starting to see more support in Europe across many of our festivals and some that are not ours as well. And that's going to give, again, that anchor where it's like it's a soft ticket. It gives them an opportunity to get in front of a lot of people without necessarily carrying the responsibility of selling those tickets. And then we can build off of that and mix in, right? Again, what we were talking about, some of the logistics issues, your ability to sell tickets in a certain market when you may be an arena market in the U.S. and then all of a sudden you got to go into Europe and you're like, I'm not sure if I sell 2,000 tickets or 12,000 tickets. And taking a risk at 12,000 tickets is very risky for an artist's career outside of the financials for a promoter or for anybody else. Like, you know, what the damage it can do of going out and like not having a successful show you'd never want to do. So the obviously what we're doing with Karol has shown, I guess, the high end of the reach in several different markets where it's been hugely successful. Mostly sold out almost nearly every show on the on sale. We're doing 2 O2s, you know, 2 Belgium, 2 in Germany, Cologne and Berlin. Sort of non-traditional, right? Like your obvious sort of go-tos were always like Milan, Paris, but London and all these other countries are starting to really show incredible amount of traction. It's very exciting. How deep that goes is what we're sort of developing, and we want to work with artists at all sizes to see how far we can go and use that with festivals. Australia is going to be a huge challenge and also a very successful tour market for Latin. There's been a few things that have gone that you've seen that have had success. We're trying, and being very transparent and honest. It's very difficult to get an artist to go down there, not because they don't believe that the business is there or because we don't believe the business is there. It's because it's very expensive to get there. It's limited probably amount of shows. They have a very specific vision that they want to take with their show, and it's difficult for an artist to deviate off of that sometimes. And so trying to figure out, right? And you could talk to a little bit about that as
I mean, to add to that, withholding tax in Australia is insane.
We were talking about Australia and New Zealand before.
There's Australia, before you even hit Australia, you got to already submit a gazillion forms to kind of to really kind of reduce the tax, and it's constraining, between the flights, the visas, everything else, like shipping your gear out there. Once you're there, touring in Australia is, I would have to say, I love touring in Latin America, but it's easier to tour in Australia. And getting there is a huge obstacle. But when you put
what's easier about it?
I mean, it's like just a little bit like they have it dialed in now. Australian touring sounds so crazy, but really what it is you narrow it down to 5-6 markets, right? So and the infrastructure, and it's an English-speaking country, right? So if most of your crew is English-speaking, it just makes everything much easier. But and they have it I think maybe historically, I feel between artists going deep into let's forget Mexico, and maybe Colombia, but going deeper into South America, right? Like Peru and the markets where I feel it's easier for artists to kind of tour Australia,
Yeah, I mean, look, there's markets in Latin America that don't have arenas, right?
Yeah.
It's like all of a sudden you're going to go and you're going to go onto a green field, which is fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's thing, but it comes in with a whole other set of challenges because your show is built to rig, your show is built for an arena. So it's possible to do it, but usually there are some other obstacles, and this isn't like a blanket statement because there are great arenas in the major cities,
some
right?
of the best.
Some of the best. Yeah. There's for everyone from Brazil and Argentina, there are some spectacular seasons. But you go to some of these markets and you're talking about one show in the country, and then once you get out of the capital, maybe there's not as many arenas and there's not as many. So you go to a place like Australia, you have 3, 5 maybe markets that are top notch. It's great. And it's all sort of controlled. There's a ton of local touring that happens there for local artists. There's a huge support in Australia for local artists. The other one going back to your question, Japan, Asia, for me is also, you've seen a few festivals out there take that opportunity and give artists that a platform where they can go and be in front of a much larger amount of audience that they'd probably be able to sell on their own. But I do feel like it's untapped, it's unproven, and for us it's certainly a focus of opening barriers in Asia in general, not just Japan, but I'm sure there are 3 or 4 markets, because we've seen it, and so it's not if, it's when, for me, that music will translate over, and it'll translate over with touring.
Yeah, and then obviously, talking about Asia, right? It's also the routes of getting there, right? Routing is to us a big obstacle, right? Whether it's North America, we have to figure out the arenas, and there's these sporting events, right? What's the season for the NBA? What's the season for hockey? All these things that kind of come into play that make our life a little bit more difficult, right? But there's a path, if you go to Australia or something, right? Combining Australia with Asia, that is, an easy gateway, and I think, being in Australia too, you don't have the, once you have the visas, you have Australia and a self-contained market where you hit Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane. There's a bunch of festivals that you can add, and then you do 2 shows. If you really want to stretch it, you do 2 shows in New Zealand. And that is a very easy kind of run. Going to South America, again, a lot of flights, a lot of kind of different countries, visas, going in and out, dealing. It's just like a little bit, and like you said, by the way, the arena is phenomenal. What about some of the stadiums in South America? I mean, insane,
100%.
you know, so, you know.
Well, yeah, the border crossing, right? Because we talk about Latin America, like if it was sometimes like one country.
Drive straight through.
You gotta, there's a whole set of challenges of flying a team. Again, visas, all that stuff, it's different staff. So yeah, there's 100% more challenges.
That's why you see like a lot of us are touring in Mexico, right? Because like crossing into, you know, like you kind of then route it in and out of Mexico, you know, makes it, you know, a little bit easier. And if you wanted to, you know, like again, Mexico, Colombia, right? Like that is sort of the easy, always feel like that's the easy fix. But then going deeper, it becomes kind of like, okay, I really need a solid plan in order to make it work, yeah.
But we absolutely, it was a great point. We absolutely, you know, focus as like North America as one route. So we don't separate necessarily Mexico as like part of a Latin American run. It's very much part of a North American run. So you very easily, just as easily as you put in Canada, you also put in Mexico as part of that anchor for your North American run.
See, we're getting a lot of questions
Yeah,
here,
I
you
think
know,
we're
love
just
that,
at
you know,
about 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a few of these questions. If anybody else has any, please put them in. The first one, how do artists balance the demands of touring with the need of creative expression and maintaining authenticity in their music? John, we talked a little bit about that. I wonder if you can get a little more into it.
I gotta fully understand that question one more time. Okay, so the balance amount of touring.
I think the question is, you know, when artists are touring so much, I think that sounds like a really
it's
exhausting
constraining,
experience. How do you keep
I mean,
up
you're right. You know, it's a
creatively?
good question. I mean, it is. You know, how do they balance it? You know, I think, you know, again, you know, with everything in life, you know, we all kind of, whether you're an artist or, you know, just a normal, you know, person, you know, I think it's like finding that life balance. You know, you know, we always think 18 months ahead in any campaign that we do, you know, and I think in that we built in times, like for example, I know in North America, you know, like I can do comfortably a 5-week tour. Then I have to take a break, you know, because I feel like, and by the way, some artists have the stamina to do, you know, 7-8 weeks, you know, but like I feel like the max in North America in one run is like, what do you think, like 7.5 weeks, right? I feel like, right, like around that, 8 maybe, you know, like, you know. But and then you break, right? Like, and you try to kind of find time to recoup, you know. And every artist has a different kind of process, you know. Like, I mean, you look at Kelly at the minute, you know, is on a roll where she literally, like, we put out 2 records within a year, you know, and critically acclaimed records, you know, like, and then the last record, you know, was, you know, maybe a year and a half ago. And, you know, we already have, you know, like, a new record also in the works, right? So, but then you have other clients and it takes them 2, 3, 4 years to make a record, you know, so, you know, and again, you know, like the authenticity is also in their music is kind of like how much can you draw on authentic experiences, you know, if you're constantly so busy, you know, like, and some people can do it and others can't, you know.
I think we've seen a lot of albums too that are inspired also by just the experience of touring and new cultures and being in new places. How do artists, is a great question, how do artists translate overnight success on digital platforms into sustainable global touring success in today's live entertainment industry? I think, Hans, if you want to take
I think it's really, and I'd like to say this very clearly, like streams do not necessarily translate into ticket sales. That is a reality. It's a misconception that just because you have an overnight success on a digital platform and your streaming numbers are huge that you're going to sell tickets. It's also combined, like where are those streams coming from? Because maybe you will sell tickets there, or you still sell some tickets there. Because this constantly appears, at least to me, where it's like I have this artist and they have this massive amount of streams. I'm like, okay, but give me the data of like where. None of them are coming from the United States. Could be an example, right? And so, if you got to be honest with yourself as well, and you have to be sort of understand that this career is really about a journey. It is a marathon. It should be a long-term plan. You should be thinking about how to sustain and how to survive, not how to get to the top. Because you get to the top, it's lonely, the air's thin, you're not really meant to like stay up there for extended amount of time. So the more that you can think about your artist's, you know, journey and your career on the long path, I think then you start to become more grounded, and how do you translate the overnight success becomes less important. You're thinking really about what is your authenticity, and how do you continue to do the authenticity to build, and then those fans will kind of come in organically, right? You want to build on what people are connected to, not necessarily how do I translate this into a global touring success.
Yeah, and I think, like we all, like in this business, and you guys can see it whether you're a fan or you work in the industry, if something is building real momentum organically, where people are pulling in and you're not pushing it onto people, right? And we all see it, we see it with influencers where they're posting 1 million times of TikTok, right? Like they have whatever, 1 million. I see all these people on social media, they have 1 million plus followers, but I don't understand if that doesn't necessarily mean they have a real business. Yes, you get then to promote some herbal tea and, whatever other weird stuff that you can promote. And I'm sure you can make a couple of $1,000 or maybe push it to $100,000 a year, but it doesn't equate into like really having momentum or a real business. And I think, Hans, like you and I see it, like, we work on Cali like for a couple of years now, we saw this kind of transition for like, okay, wow, we are now building into, we have an arena type of business, right. We knew, yes, the data is great, and we see if the streams go up from 10 million to 20 million to 40 million monthly listeners, you're like, okay, this is pretty good data. And like I said earlier, Sacramento, like for years I've been hounding the agent and hounding everybody and talking about Sacramento, and yes, we made it there in Sacramento, but it could have also been not a disaster, but it could have also been like, okay, hey, it was okay, but we didn't crush it in Sacramento just because the data is pointing there,
And just to add to that, right?
Yeah.
So, because we had a very honest conversation about it, and also like the goal isn't necessarily say, oh, we want to go and do arenas. Like, no, you want to create this. You're promoters. You want to create this sort of image of success, and the best way to create the image of success is a sold out show, which
That's
is true
right.
success.
Period.
Right? So overshooting yourself and trying to go too fast, too soon may create that, yeah, maybe the Sacramento thing would have been fine and we would have sold it out, but maybe not. Maybe we would, and we would, right, again, like there's no such thing as bad shows, there's bad deals. You put an artist in a place that fits 12,000, they sell 2,000, it's a shit show. You put it in a club, it fits 2,000, you have a sold out show. That's a success. Right? So knowing how to be strategic about your decisions and what you gain from them is really key. So going into saying we're going to do a theater show, which has the benefits again of your production, not overshooting, like keeping your costs controlled, getting out into more markets, seeing what the market is, testing the market, because we're thinking about the next 10 years. We're not thinking about the overnight success that Telepatía was.
No, you're right. I mean, look what we did, for example, like to finish up there, but we pushed also we knew that we had an arena business, that we were getting there. But at the same time, we opted for, on the last tour, we said, hey, let's do 2 Radio City Halls because it's a rite of passage. It's a cool thing. 2 Radio City Halls is basically in Madison Square Garden, we sold it out so fast. That means we could have also done a Madison Square Garden. But then, you missed the opportunity of these 2 beautiful shows at Radio City Hall, iconic, right? And then so we saved the Madison, MSG for, the next run, right? If we would have done it now, it would have been a different thing. What are we doing now? Going back to it, So you want to build to that. And again, maybe the last point, because we have more questions here, is your data. You got to be careful with the data. The data is misleading. What he said earlier too. You might have. What does it mean if you have? Especially in TikTok. TikTok right now is in disarray, right? For artists too, right? Because Universal has taken down all their catalog. Universal Publishing. So what is actually happening on that platform? Completely unregulated. But people come to me, it's like, I have 1 million. Sounds on or plays on TikTok. I was like, oh, that's great. That sound is 30 seconds. Doesn't necessarily always translate into Spotify plays. So kind of again, you accumulate short form content where people we all do it, right? We mindlessly scroll, we stop at something, we're like, oh, this is kind of cool, but again, it still takes a lot to then go on Spotify and listen to it and become a fan and start engaging and buying tickets and everything else, right? So, yeah.
I'm going to ask maybe 2 at a time because we still have quite a few. But Taiga Ishibashi wants to know, coming from Japan, you mentioned that the market in Japan is untapped. What would you say are the barriers? And then kind of sort of on the flip side of that, what about artists that aren't from cultures like Latin America, which is something that we were talking about with the popularity of Afrobeats. So maybe we can answer those at the same time.
Try to keep it to under a minute so we can get through more. Look, I think the Japan thing is going back. There's logistical issues or logistical challenges for the artist to get over there without knowing what the market represents. and what they're doing. So they could be, again, an arena act somewhere, and then all of a sudden they go to Japan, and we have no idea. Back to what I was talking about before. So, more inclusion from festivals, seeing what's happening culturally also helps, having local partners that are paying attention to those things, right? I have our offices in Europe. I had one of my guys in Vienna saying, I go to this Latin party that happens every week. I was like, oh, wow, that's great. Tell me more about it. What are they playing? Like having local partners that are at least interested in seeing it gives us a better gauge or better, at least a little bit more security that we should try something, and then I'll go try to convince the artist, or I'll convince, have John do it.
I mean, again, Japan, by the way, I feel like Japan is not even, I want to make that clear, right? Like, I don't think it's untapped. Japan is a massive, I've been to Japan a million times. It's dialed in on touring, it's great to tour in Japan. It's just like Japan, like, I can also talk about Germany because, that's where I'm from, like, those are, I say they with love and admiration for both territories, they're just odd kind of, when it comes to music, listening, they're very specific, right? So there's things in Japan that are massive, and things in Germany that are massive, like one of our clients, Depeche Mode, is literally playing stadiums, multiple stadiums, and then they come back for arenas, and it's just one of their biggest markets, right? And in Japan, you have that too, where like, I was in a meeting the other day, and was told that Carly Rae Jepsen can do arenas in Japan, and I'm like, that is amazing, so if it works in Japan, and we know what works in Japan, it's huge, and if it doesn't, it's kind of like, the barriers are really, I don't even think it's the language so much, it's like it's that Japanese society and culture, and young kids, they're very specific with what they like. I remember going to Japan 15 years ago, and hip-hop, there was, like, you feel like certain things are more preserved there, like Japanese jazz or Japanese, hip-hop, the appreciation for that. You go to a hip-hop club, and it's like better than any hip-hop club that you would see in the United States, even in the 90s at the time, like same with jazz, but it's just like some things work and some things work, and there's no rhyme or reason to it sometimes, and yeah, it's interesting to see. And I think the other part is, what are the artists that are not coming? What is it? Culture. I mean, okay, we're moving on, right? So like the questions are now disappearing.
What
It's
about
good.
artists
So
that
we have 4
aren't
minutes,
from? Yeah. Do you want to answer that though? Because we were talking about Afrobeats and sort of other genres or parts of the world that could use sort of the.
Oh, got it.
The
That's
path
okay.
strap.
Yeah. What about artists that aren't from cultures like Latin America and don't have a lot of
There's a
immigrants
lot
in the
of
U.S.?
it,
Yeah, I mean, I think too. Like, listen, you see like the most random stuff that it kind of then works in North America, like the whole K-pop thing is interesting because while you do have a huge, Korean and Asian community, but this has also transitioned way out of, like I think there's a lot of kids in general, right, that is, like just hugely into that, right? But then you take that in terms of, if you look at streaming numbers, like how the streaming numbers for K-pop is outside of these territories, right? Like Europe, for example, like it's very low. So it's also like, some things are just, there's an attraction to, BTS and Blackpink, like, and massive, but like it's not like everywhere the same, I think, so, I don't know.
All right, we're going to do rapid fire.
Yes.
Somebody Sydney Souza works as a video designer for concert touring. How do you plan for scalability within a tour, or plan for an artist skyrocketing in popularity while touring? Hans, if you want to take that.
Dynamic pricing. I guess.
No, I mean, look, I again, it's going back to that first conversation that we were talking about, where it's like you gotta plan, keep things sort of in line for what you're trying to do to maximize it, right? Like to maximize it, and understanding you might be really big in one market, it becomes incredibly challenging. If you want to say, be like, oh my God, I'm going to go do the Sphere in Vegas, which then you can't tour. But right after that, I'm going to go on the rest of this U.S. tour. It's going to be a different production in the round. And then I'm going to go to Europe, where I'm going to do theaters, when you just created this video. You know what I mean? Those are the things that are obvious, and like those are just conversations of saying, does this make sense or not? Like, this is a money thing at the end of the day, of saying you're going to just blow all your money by creating different experiences. How do you create something that you can put in a theater and then scale it up into an arena? How do you those are real conversations of things that you can do, that we have done. As a video designer, I think you gotta think about those benefits to a manager, when your selling point is, okay, the scalability is I can do this in a theater and then I can move this into an arena efficiently with, you know, with costs that don't necessarily need to skyrocket on your production. I mean, I don't know if you have other.
I mean, you know, I think as a manager, what I look at specifically, because you're a video designer, you know, like I need the content. If I have to fill a 60-minute show, I know I can't program the whole show with the most expensive 3D kind of imaging, you know, so it kind of has to be a combination where I use, if I have video, you know, I got to use the iMac, you know, like to kind of have some of it be live footage projected onto my screens and the LED screen. I need to have some type of footage that is, you know, beautiful visuals, you know, like that don't cost me a fortune. And then at the height of my show, I have like 3-4 important kind of climaxes in the tour, you know, like, and then that's where I want to have like, you know, the video designer go crazy and give me the most innovative best he can, you know? No.
All right, and so for the last, oh.
If you have
Last
good ideas,
20.
call me. We're always looking for video designers, you know, so yeah, sure.
Last 20 seconds. Do genre mixing artists struggle with gaining an audience? If so, how do these artists establish a consistent fan base in the industry?
Quick answer from me, I don't think so. But you know, it's like I think it's more like if an artist has continuously like made a certain sound and then all of a sudden you make this weird record that every artist does, you know, like, and you know, like if it's so out there and wild, I think you're gonna struggle a little bit, you know. But like if you, like I said, with Kelly, we put out a English speaking, Spanish speaking, you know, we combine it and it's just going up and up and up.
Do we have time for the very last one? If we do it quickly. Why do artists like Drake and Bad Bunny, why do you think artists like Drake and Bad Bunny haven't ventured out into Europe lately, considering the record-breaking tours they've both had? And I think with Bad Bunny, he's coming off of like 2 years of touring.
No, Drake has done a bunch of European stuff. I mean, is he?
Yeah, they have, and you know,
I think they mean specific to maybe this new. I mean, Bad Bunny, I think, is on tour right now. And
right. So I mean, Bunny's the schedules. Again, going back to some of the other questions that you were talking about, where we're talking like how do you maintain your authenticity while you're on the road and your creativity. We've seen new projects come from both of these artists. Sometimes they're balancing that out and not necessarily have time to fit everything in one calendar year. But we've seen both of these artists go to Europe and undeniably they will return.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Thank you.